The message lasted 12 seconds, but it split her world in two. The hospital waiting room in Columbus, Ohio felt unusually still that afternoon. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Marlo Bennett sat alone in a pale gray chair, her medical folder pressed tightly against her chest as if it could hold her together. She was 36, strong on the outside, but carrying fear she had not spoken out loud to anyone. Her doctor had just explained that the surgery she needed was urgent, life-saving. The only clear path forward. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Her heart jumped into her throat. As she answered quick, instead of a real person, a recorded voice began. Her fingers slipped, and without realizing it, switched the call to speak. Hello, Marlo Bennett. This message is to inform you that your recent pre-authorization request for surgery has been denied. Based on policy review, the procedure does not meet coverage criteria at this time. You may file an appeal in 30 days. The word echoed louder than the rest. The voicemail ended with a soft beep, but Marlo did not move. Her chest tightened so suddenly, she had to grip the edge of her chair. She tried to breathe slowly, but the air felt thin. Her hands trembled, and her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She swallowed hard, trying to keep control. She did not want strangers watching her. Across the hallway sat a widowed single father, Callan Rivers, with his 7-year-old triplets, Elodie, Brooks, and Tatum. They were waiting for Tatum's minor follow-up appointment. Nothing serious. Callan believed in showing up for every small thing. Since losing his wife 4 years earlier, he had promised himself his children would never sit alone. He held a clipboard of paperwork, reviewing insurance details of his own, when the voicemail carried across the quiet space. Elodie looked up first. She had always been sensitive to emotional Brooks stopped swinging his sneakers under the chair. Tatum's eyes slowly turned toward the sound. They saw Marlo before Callan fully. Marlo's shoulders folded inward. She pressed her lips together, fighting tears that refused. The empty chair beside her looked louder than her breath. No partner sat close. No friend leaned in to whisper reassurance. Just silence. Elodie leaned toward her father. Dad, that lady. Callan followed her gaze and saw the shaking hands, the stiff posture, the quiet breakdown happening in plain sight. He hesitated. Hospitals were private spaces. He understood that deeply. He had once sat in similar chairs while doctors spoke words he never wanted to hear. He knew how heavy loneliness could feel in a place like this. Brooks whispered, "She's alone, and she's scared." Marlo replayed the voicemail as if hoping she had misheard it. The same words repeated: denied. Appeal. 30 days. 30 days felt impossible when your body could not wait. Callan stood slowly, careful not to intrude. He walked partway across the hallway and stopped at a respectful distance. "Excuse me, are you all right?" Marlo forced a small nod. "Just..." Her voice betrayed her. Elodie stepped a little closer beside her father. It didn't sound like just insurance. Marlo looked at the children, surprised by their honesty. Their faces held no judgment, only concern. "It's nothing." She tried again, but her voice cracked halfway through. Callan's tone remained calm and steady. "Insurance appeal overwhelming. I've been through a few myself." She blinked. "You have?" He nodded. "When my wife was sick, we had to fight for approvals more than once." The words were simple, but they carried shared understanding. The triplets exchanged a glance. They knew that chapter well. They had seen their father stay awake late filling out forms, making calls, asking questions politely but firmly. They had watched him stay when systems failed, and hope felt small. Brooks leaned toward his dad and whispered, "She doesn't have anyone." Callan noticed it fully now. The empty chair, the untouched coffee cup, no incoming messages on. Just silence. He asked gently, "Is someone coming to sit with you?" "No, it's just me." The words felt heavier than the denial itself. Elodie reached out without thinking and lightly touched Marlo's hand. "You shouldn't hear news like that by yourself." Marlo's breath caught in her chest. She had spent years handling everything alone. Appointments, paperwork. She had convinced herself she did not need anyone. But sitting there in that bright hallway, she felt the truth. Strength does not cancel loneliness. Callan studied her carefully. His children were not reacting only to the medical problem. They were reacting to isolation. They sensed something adults often ignore. He realized something then. The voicemail did not just deny, it exposed abandonment. And as Marlo sat there trying to stay composed, the triplets understood something their father had not yet fully. This woman wasn't just fighting for her health. She was fighting with no one standing beside her. Some people leave when life becomes heavy, but he stayed when it crushed him. Years before the hospital hallway and the cold voicemail, Grayson Rivers stood in a different waiting room with three newborn babies and a silence he never expected. His wife, Lila, had gone into the hospital smiling, nervous but hopeful. The delivery had complications no one saw coming. What was supposed to be celebration turned. Within days, Grayson was handed three tiny blankets and unbearable news. Leela did not make it home. He remembered standing in the nursery that first night alone, staring at three bassinets and up beside each other. Elodie cried first. Brooks followed. Tatum's face turned red as he searched for a voice that would never answer again. Grayson felt fear like he had never known before. Not fear of diapers or fear of failing them. Fear of being the only one left. Family came at first. His parents stayed a week. Lila's sister visited twice. Friends filled the house with casseroles and soft apologies. But grief is loud at the beginning and quiet later. Slowly, the calls became. Everyone had their own lives to return to. Grayson did not blame them. Still, the house grew quieter. He learned to function on almost no. During the day, he worked construction under hot sun and cold wind, lifting beams and pouring concrete with tired arms. At night, after rocking three babies to sleep, he delivered food across town to cover medical debt. Hospital bills from Lila's emergency treatment stacked high in a drawer he tried not to open too often. The numbers never seemed to. There were nights he sat on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m., holding one baby while the other two cried in shifts, wondering how he would survive the next day. But he never once considered walking away. He never thought about escape. Staying was not heroic to him, it was necessary. As the triplets grew from infants into toddlers, and then into curious 7-year-olds, something quietly formed inside them. They had watched their father come home exhausted, but still kneel to tie shoes and read bedtime stories. They had seen him rub his forehead at the kitchen table while studying hospital stuff, then look up and smile when they entered the room. They learned early that strength does not shout, it stays. Elodie became the watcher. She could tell when her father was worried by the way he folded laundry too. Brooks learned to help without being asked, carrying groceries even when they felt heavy for his small arms. Tatum developed a gentle way of asking, "Are you okay, Dad?" at moments when Grayson thought he had hidden his stress well. Grayson never sat them down to teach, he simply lived it. He showed them that pain does not excuse you from love. He showed them that tired does not mean He showed them that staying is a choice made every morning, but the system never felt kind. Insurance battles over Lila's treatment drained him emotionally. He remembered long phone calls where recorded voices repeated policy language while he tried to explain that a human life was not paperwork. He remembered appeal letters, delayed responses. He remembered the cold tone of denial. That was why Marlowe's voicemail hit deeper than he expected. When he heard the words pre-authorization denied echo across the hallway, something old tightened in his chest. It was not just it was recognition. He knew that sound. The flat, professional voice that delivered decisions without compassion. The kind of message that makes you feel small and alone. He looked at Marlowe and saw more than a stranger. He saw someone standing at the edge of the same system that once left him fighting alone. But he hesitated. It was not his place, he told. People deserve privacy in their hardest moments. He had hated when strangers looked at him with pity. After Lila passed, he did not want to become another reminder of weakness. For Elodie watched him carefully. She knew that look on his face. It was the look he had when he wanted to help but feared crossing a line. Brooks leaned closer to his sibling. Dad knows that. Tatum. He's remembering Mom. Grayson kept his voice steady when he spoke to Marlowe, offering gentle words about appeals. But inside, memories moved like quiets. He remembered sitting alone in a similar chair, wishing someone would simply say, "You don't have to do this by yourself." The triplets sensed something more. They did not just see a woman who needed surgery. They saw the same loneliness that once surrounded their father. They knew how heavy that loneliness could. When Marlowe said softly, "It's just me," the words felt too familiar. Grayson told himself again that kindness must respect boundaries. He could offer information, maybe a phone number for a patient advocate, but he should not step too far. He had his own children to think, his own responsibilities. What he did not notice was the quiet conversation happening in whispers beside him. Elodie's eyes held determination. Brooks looked thoughtful. Tatum's expression was serious in a way most 7-year-olds rarely are. They had grown up watching their father stay when others left. They had learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand beside someone in silence. Grayson believed the moment would pass. After a few kind words, he did not realize that while he was debating what was appropriate, his children were already thinking about. Grayson told himself it wasn't his place to step in. But the triplets were already planning something he never saw coming. She had spent her whole life teaching children how to express feeling, but now she had no one to hear her own. Marlo Bennett had always been the calm one in every room. As a Deedle school art teacher, she spent her days helping students turn confusion into color and fear into brushstrokes. Her classroom walls were covered with paintings that told quiet stories. She believed art could heal parts of the heart that words could not reach. But that afternoon in the hospital waiting room, she felt like a blank canvas with a crack down the center. She had no close family left. Her parents had passed away years earlier, and her only brother lived across the country with a life too busy for long phone calls. She had friends, yes, but not the kind you call when a doctor says. Most of her evenings were quiet, spent grading papers or sketching small designs in a notebook she never showed anyone. Her condition was serious, but the doctor had been. With surgery, her recovery chances were strong. Without it, the risk would grow. The procedure was not experimental. It was necessary. But insurance had denied it over a technical loop, claiming that certain documentation had been submitted out of sequence. Marlo had already filed one appeal weeks earlier for a different authorization had been delayed. Now the second denial felt like a wall closing in. She replayed the voicemail in her mind even after the sound stopped. Denied. Appeal within the words felt colder each time. When she finally stood up from the hospital chair, she did so slowly, adjusting her posture the way it did in front of her to appear strong. She refused to cry in public, to look fragile. She walked down the hallway with careful steps, nodding politely at a nurse who passed by, as if nothing inside her had cracked. Outside the hospital entrance, she sat on a wooden bench near the parking lot. The late afternoon sun felt warm against her skin, but it did not reach the heaviness in her chest. She unlocked, at her phone again and pressed play on the voicemail. She listened carefully, as if searching for hidden hope between the robotic sentences. Across the glass doors, three small faces pressed closer to the wall. Elodie, Brooks, and Tatum had followed her movement silently with their eyes. They had watched her leave the waiting room. They had seen the way she carried herself, steady on the outside, trembling on the inside. Brooks whispered. Tatum frowned. Why would someone listen to bad news twice? Because sometimes you want to make sure. He saw Marlo sitting alone on the bench, her shoulders stiff, her eyes locked on her phone screen. He felt that familiar pull in his chest, the memory of sitting alone after Lila's treatments, replaying calls from insurance companies, trying to understand language that never felt human. Helping meant emotional risk. He knew that well. When you step into someone else's pain, you carry a part of it with you. He had learned to protect his heart carefully after losing his wife. He had responsibility. He had children who depended on him staying steady, but the triplets were not thinking about risk. They were thinking about loneliness. She shouldn't go home like that. Brooks nodded. Dad always says no one should sit alone when there's. Grayson heard them. He had said that once, late at night, when explaining why he stayed in hospital rooms long after visiting hours, and he believed in presence. But belief and action are not always the same when fear is involved. Marlo pressed play on the voicemail one more time. This time her hand covered her mouth, as if to block out the word. A tear slipped down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. The parking lot around her felt wide and empty. Cars passed in the distance. No one slowed down. Elodie stepped back from the glass door and turned to her. Dad, when Mom was in the hospital, you didn't leave her alone. Grayson swallowed hard. That was different. Was it? Brooks asked gently. The question lingered in the air. Marlo lowered her phone and stared ahead. For the first time, she allowed her shoulder. She looked smaller somehow, like someone carrying weight too heavy for one. The triplets looked at one another, communicating without many words. They had grown up watching their father choose presence over. They had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can sit beside someone in silence. Grayson felt the battle inside him. He could offer information, maybe suggest a patient advocate, but stepping further meant opening his heart to someone else's struggle. It meant risking attachment. It meant allowing hope to grow in a place that had once been broken. He hesitated. But his children were already moving. Elodie pushed open the hospital door gently. Brooks followed. Tatum held the door wide enough for all three to slip outside together. Grayson blinked in surprise. Wait, he started, but they were already crossing the sidewalk toward the bench. Marlo looked up as three small shadows fell across the ground in front of her. And what they were about to say would change the direction of her. The children decided this woman would not leave that, and what they did next surprised even their father. She had spent her whole life teaching children how to express feeling, but now she had no one to hear her. Marlo Bennett, had always been the calm one in him. As a middle school art teacher, she spent her days helping students turn confusion into color and fear into brushstrokes. Her classroom walls were covered with the paintings that told quiet stories. She believed art could heal parts of the heart that words could not reach. But that afternoon in the hospital waiting room, she felt like a blank canvas with a crack down the center. She had no close family left. Her parents had passed away years earlier, and her only brother lived across the country with a life too busy for long phone calls. She had friends, yes, but not the kind you call when a doctor says. Most of her evenings were quiet, spent grading papers or sketching small designs in a notebook she never showed anyone. Her condition was serious, but the doctor had been clear. With surgery, her recovery chances were strong. Without it, the risk would grow. The procedure was not experimental, it was necessary, but insurance had denied it over a technical loop, claiming that certain documentation had been submitted out of sequence. Marlowe had already filed one appeal weeks earlier for a different authorization detail. It had been delayed. Now this second denial felt like a wall closing. She replayed the voicemail in her mind even after the sound stopped. Denied. Appeal within 30 days. The words felt colder each time. When she finally stood up from the hospital chair, she did so slowly, adjusting her posture the way it did in front of her student. When she wanted to appear strong, she refused to cry in public. She refused to look fragile. She walked down the hallway with careful steps, nodding politely at a nurse who passed by, as if nothing inside her had cracked. Outside the hospital, she sat on a wooden bench near the parking lot. The late afternoon sun felt warm against her skin, but it did not reach the heaviness in her. She unlocked her phone again and pressed play on the voicemail. She listened carefully, as if searching for hidden hope between the robotic sentences. Across the glass doors, three small faces pressed closer to the window. Elodie, Brooks, and Tatum had followed her movements silently with their eyes. They had watched her leave the waiting room. They had seen the way she carried herself, steady on the outside, trembling on the. She's listening to it. Tatum frowned. Why would someone listen to bad news twice? Because sometimes you want to make sure it's real. Grayson stepped beside them, noticing their focus. He saw Marlowe sitting alone on the bench, her shoulders stiff, her eyes locked on her phone screen. He felt that familiar pull in his chest, the memory of sitting alone after Lila's treatments, replaying calls from insurance companies, trying to understand language that never felt human. Helping meant emotional risk. He knew that well. When you step into someone else's pain, you carry a part of it with you. He had learned to protect his heart carefully after losing his wife. He had responsibility. He had children who depended on him staying steady, but the triplets were not thinking about. They were thinking about loneliness. She shouldn't go home like that. Brooks nodded. Dad always says no one should sit alone when they're scared. Grayson heard. He had said that once, late at night when explaining why he stayed in hospital rooms long after visiting hours ended. He believed in presence, but belief and action are not always the same when fear is involved. Marlowe pressed play on the voicemail. This time, her hand covered her mouth as if to block out the words. A tear slipped down her cheek. The parking lot around her felt wide and empty. Cars passed in the distance. No one slowed down. Elodie stepped back from the glass door and turned to her father. Dad, when Mom was in the hospital, you didn't leave her alone. Grayson swallowed hard. That was it? Brooks asked gently. The question lingered in the. Marlowe lowered her phone and stared ahead. For the first time, she allowed her shoulders to drop. She looked smaller somehow, like someone carrying weight too heavy for one person. The triplets looked at one another. They had grown up watching their father choose presence over comfort. They had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit beside someone else. Grayson felt the battle inside him. He could offer information, maybe suggest a patient advocate, but stepping further meant opening his heart to someone else's struggle. It meant risking attachment. It meant allowing hope to grow in a place that had once been broken. He hesitated, but his children were already moving. Elodie pushed open the hospital door gently. Brooks followed. Tatum held the door wide enough for all three to slip outside together. Grayson blinked in surprise. Wait. But they were already crossing the sidewalk toward. Marlowe looked up as three small shadows fell across the ground in front of her, and what they were about to say would change the direction of her. The children decided this woman would not leave that hospital alone, and what they did next surprised even their father. Adults learn to look away from pain, but children often walk straight toward it. Marlowe looked up from her phone when she noticed three small figures standing in front of her. Elodie stood in the middle, her expression gentle but serious. Brooks kept his hands in his jacket pockets, shifting slightly on his. Tatum held a folded hospital bra like it was something important. None of them spoke at first. They simply stood there, close enough to show they cared, but are enough to respect space. You forgot something, Elodie said. Marlowe blinked in confusion. I did? You forgot that you don't have to sit alone, Brooks added quietly. The words were not dramatic. They were not loud. They were simple and honest. Marlowe felt her chest tighten again, but this time it was not from fear, from surprise. She was used to being the one who comforted others. Students came to her when they felt invisible. Parents thanked her for it. But she could not remember the last time someone walked toward her sadness without being asked. Before she could respond, Grayson stepped outside, slightly breathless, apologetic in his expression. I'm sorry, he said gently. They move faster than I expect sometimes. It's all right. Grayson glanced at his children and then back at her. He saw the faint redness in her eyes, the way her phone still rested tightly in her. He felt that old familiar ache inside him, the memory of sitting alone in hospital parking lots, staring at bills and medical forms that felt bigger than his strength. We didn't mean to intrude, Elodie said carefully. We just thought, maybe you shouldn't be by yourself right now. Marlowe swallowed hard. That's very kind of you. Do you have someone you can call? The question was innocent, but it carried weight. Marlowe hesitated. She had colleagues, a neighbor who sometimes waved from across the yard. But in this moment, there was no one she could call without feeling like she was disturbing their life. No, admitted softly. Not really. Grayson felt something shift inside him. Hearing those words out loud made the loneliness real. He remembered the day he received Lila's diagnosis. He had stepped outside the hospital and scrolled through his contacts, unsure who to call. Everyone felt busy. Everyone felt far away. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving space between. I know it's not the same, he said carefully, but I've dealt with insurance appeals before. Sometimes the wording can be misleading. Marlowe looked at him, unsure whether to accept the offer. She had learned to protect her independence carefully. Accepting help sometimes felt like weakness. It's just paperwork. Brooks shook his head slightly. Paperwork can still hurt. That simple statement made her almost laugh through her teeth. Elodie reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded drawing. I made this for the nurse, she explained, but I think you need it more. It was a bright sketch of a tree with deep roots and wide branches. Underneath it she had written, Strong things grow even in storm. Marlowe stared at the drawing. You made this? Elodie nodded. Marlowe whispered, her voice trembling again. Grayson watched the exchange and felt both proud and humbled. His children were not trying to fix the problem. They were offering presents. He had taught them to stay when things felt uncomfortable. Now they were teaching him not to step back too quick. Tatum asked gently, pointing to the folder on Marlowe's lap. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. The denial letter was printed in formal language, filled with policy codes and technical explanations. Grayson leaned slightly closer, careful not to invade her space. As he read, he felt that familiar frustration build. The language was cold, almost mechanical. It referenced submission's complete classification, but something about it felt off. You already appealed once? Yes, Marlowe said, for a different part of the authorization process. They delayed it. Now this. Brooks frowned. That doesn't. Grayson nodded slowly. It might not be. He pointed to a paragraph near the middle of the page. This section references documentation received. But your consultation was on the 17th, right? Marlowe looked closer. Yes. That means they're denying it based on information submitted before your most recent evaluation, he said carefully. That doesn't make sense. She leaned in, reading again. For the first time since hearing the voicemail, her breathing steadied slightly. Not because the problem was solved, but because someone else was looking at it. Elodie rested her head lightly against Marlowe's arm. We can sit with you while you figure it out. The offer was small, but it carried warmth. Grayson felt his protective instinct fully awaken now. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. He knew what it felt like to fight system. You don't have to decide anything today, he said. But if you want, I can help you draft another. Sometimes it helps to have someone read it with fresh eyes. Marlowe looked at the four of them, a father who understood silent battles, and three children who were. For the first time that day, she did not feel invisible. But as Grayson's eyes moved back over the denial letter, something caught his attention. A code reference near the bottom that did not match the earlier explanation. His expression changed slightly. Wait. Marlowe looked at him. What is it? He traced the line with his finger, reading it twice to be sure. because what he had just noticed in that letter was not a simple mistake. While reviewing the denial paperwork, Grayson discovered a detail that could change everything, and it was something the insurance company never expected anyone to question. Sometimes hope does not arrive loudly. It hides inside a single line of fine print. Grayson read the denial letter again, slower this time, his finger tracing the coded language near the bottom of the page. The words looked ordinary, almost boring, but something about the classification number did not sit right with him. He had seen similar codes years ago while fighting for Lila's treatment. He remembered how one small label had delayed care for weeks. They marked this as elective, he said quietly. Marlowe blinked. What? Procedure classification. Non-urgent elective intervention. That's why it was denied under this policy section. Her face drained of color. That's not possible. My doctor said it can't wait. Elodie leaned closer, reading upside down with surprising focus. Brooks frowned at the word elective, sounding it out softly. Tatum looked between the adults, sensing the shift in energy. I trusted the hospital admin office to file everything correctly, Marlowe said, her voice unsteady. I gave them all the paperwork. I thought it was handled. Sometimes the coding department enters procedures into the system using general categories. If they selected elective instead of urgent surgical intervention, the insurance system would automatically deny it. Marlowe pressed her hand to her forehead. So this whole thing could be a technical error? It looks like it, he replied carefully. But technical errors still need someone to fight them. The triplets exchanged a look. They had overheard enough to understand the heart of the problem. The surgery was necessary. A label was wrong. A system had responded coldly. It felt unfair in a way children immediately recognized. Brooks suddenly said, Dad, remember Mr. Calder? Grayson looked at him, confused. Mr. Calder? The ma. And you delivered packages to last winter, Elodie explained. The one who gave us hot chocolate when it was snowing. You said he worked on the hospital board. Grayson's memory clicked into place. During the hardest months after Lila passed, he had taken extra delivery shifts. One route included a large home near the edge of town. An older man named Daniel Calder had often accepted packages personally. They had spoken briefly a few times. When Grayson mentioned his wife's hospital bill, Calder had listened longer than expected. He had mentioned being involved in hospital administration oversight. That was a long time ago, Grayson said cautiously. But he was nice, Elodie said. You said he cared about how the hospital treats families. Marlowe looked at Grayson with a, You know someone on the hospital board. No is a strong word, he said. We spoke a handful of times. I delivered packages. That's all. Brooks tilted his head. Sometimes that's enough. Grayson hesitated. He felt small thinking about calling someone with influence. He was a construction worker and part-time delivery driver. He did not move in important circles. He had learned to solve problems quietly, not by asking for favors. Marlowe shook her head gently. I don't want to cause trouble. I don't want to be... You're not, Tatum said softly. The words landed with unexpected strength. Grayson looked at Marlowe again, really looked at her. He saw the exhaustion behind her calm. He saw someone who had done everything right and still ended up alone on a bench listening to a rejection message. He remembered sitting in that same position years ago, wishing someone would challenge the system. Helping meant stepping outside comfort. It meant risking disappointment. It meant asking someone powerful to care. He took a slow breath. I can try calling him, he said finally. No promises, just a conversation. Marlowe's eyes filled with cautious hope. Why would he listen? And sometimes kindness circles back. He stepped aside and scrolled through old contacts. The number was still saved. His thumb hovered over the call button for a second longer than necessary. The triplet stood silent, but steady. The phone rang twice. Daniel Calder speaking. Grayson cleared his throat. Mr. Calder, this is Grayson Rivers. I used to deliver packages to your home last winter. There was a pause, then a warm response. Ah, yes. The young father with 3 curious children. I remember. How are you? I'm calling because I'm sitting with someone who may need help navigating a hospital coding issue. He explained the situation simply, without exaggeration. He mentioned the elective classification error and the urgency described by the physician. He did not demand, he asked for guidance. There was silence on the other end, thoughtful rather than That should not happen, Mr. Calder said finally. If a procedure is urgent, it must be coded correctly. I can request a review meeting tomorrow morning. Bring the documentation. Marlowe's breath caught. Tomorrow. Grayson covered the phone slightly. He's offering to arrange a review. When he ended the call, he felt a strange mix of relief and nervous anticipation. Marlowe looked at him, not as a stranger on a bench, but as someone who stepped forward when it mattered. For the first time in months, she said quietly, "I feel like someone is fighting with me." Elodie smiled. Brooks nodded. Tatum leaned lightly against her side. Hope had not arrived with noise. It arrived through connection, but as Grayson folded the denial letter and looked at the hospital building behind them, he knew something. Insurance companies do not reverse decisions, and somewhere inside that system, someone would not want this appealed. They had found a doorway into the system, but someone powerful was already preparing to keep it closed. Systems are built to protect people, but sometimes they protect themselves first. The morning after Daniel Calder arranged the review meeting, Grayson and Marlowe sat at her small kitchen table surrounded by papers. Medical reports were stacked carefully. Doctor notes were highlighted. Timelines were written out clearly in Grayson's neat handwriting. They were not preparing for an argument. They were preparing for clarity. What they did not know yet was that Marlowe's case had already been flagged inside the insurance system. The procedure was marked high cost. An internal note labeled it financially significant. That label did not consider her as a person, only as a number attached to behind office doors. Approval percentages were quietly monitored. Large payouts required extra review. Delays saved money. When Daniel Calder requested the coding audit through the hospital board, it caused movement inside departments that preferred silence. Emails were exchanged. Supervisors were no one wanted the hospital accused of misclassification. No one wanted the insurance company questioned publicly. Grayson felt a steady anger rising inside him as he reviewed the documents. He had seen this before, the way language could shrink human urgency into administrative categories, but he did not raise his voice. He did not storm into offices. He gathered facts. "Stay calm," he said quietly, organizing the paperwork, and "we stay clear." Marlowe watched him with something deeper than gratitude. She saw discipline. She saw patience under pressure. She had expected frustration or bitterness. Instead, she saw steady action. Meanwhile, the triplets were busy in their own quiet way. Elodie had asked if they could do something helpful too. Brooks suggested making a small online art page where people could share stories about kindness in hard systems. Tatum added that they could include drawings about medical fair. With Grayson's supervision, they created a simple community art board called Stand Beside. They posted Elodie's tree drawing first along with a short message. No one should fight alone. It was not dramatic. It was not accusatory. It was honest. Within days, teachers from Marlowe's school shared it. Parents commented with similar insurance stories. A local community page reposted the artwork. The story began spreading quietly, not as outrage, but as awareness. Daniel Calder noticed. He called Grayson 2 evenings later. "There is growing attention around this. Hospitals prefer quiet resolutions. I've requested a formal secondary review with the insurance liaison present." The next day, Marlowe received a call from an insurance representative. The voice was professional but less distant. "Your case has been approved for secondary review. Due to coding clarification, we will notify you within 48 hours. Marlowe's hand trembled slightly after ending the call. Hope can feel as frightening as disappointment when you have been let down before. What if they deny it again? Grayson did not rush to comfort her with empty promises. Instead, he stood and began organizing her documents in a clean folder again. "Then we keep going." "We don't. Stop because it gets hard." She watched him closely. He did not speak about destiny or fairness. He spoke about persistence. Over the next 2 days, the bond between deepened quietly. It was not romantic. It was not dramatic. It was built in shared coffee cups, shared paperwork, shared silence. The triplets began calling her Miss Marlowe at first, then just Marlowe when she was okay. She helped Tatum with a sketch for school. Brooks showed her how to edit the community art page. Elodie asked if she would like to visit their house for dinner after the review. Marlowe realized something slowly. She had walked into that hospital alone. Now she was sitting at a table surrounded by presents. Found family does not announce itself. It forms in moments when someone chooses. But systems do not shift easily. Behind the scenes, an insurance regional manager reviewed the case personally. Approving it would increase quarterly expenses. Denying it again risked public criticism. The story gained more. Grayson sensed the tension build. He could feel that something larger than paperwork was. Still, he stayed composed. On the morning of the final review decision, they gathered again. Marlowe insisted on walking to the hospital with steady step. Even though her body felt weaker than before, the stress had taken a toll, become light and broken. They stood near the entrance when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen but did not answer immediately. Her breathing grew uneven. Grayson noticed her shoulders sway slightly. Marlowe? He asked softly. She tried to respond, but her vision blurred suddenly. The folder slipped from her hand. Papers scattered onto the pavement, and before Grayson could reach her fully, her knees gave way. The triplets gasped as she collapsed unexpectedly onto the sidewalk outside the hospital. Doors. Grayson caught her just before she hit the ground. The review decision had not yet been announced, but now Marlowe's body was running out of time. Hope can feel strongest in the exact moment. Everything seems to fall apart. Marlowe's body felt weightless for a second before everything turned dark. When she collapsed outside the hospital door, Grayson caught her just in time, lowering her gently to the ground as nurses rushed forward. The triplets stood frozen, their small faces pale but steady. They did not scream. They did not panic. They moved closer, forming a quiet circle around her, as if their presence alone could hold. Within minutes, she was inside on a stretcher, monitors attached, doctors speaking in urgent but controlled voices. The weakness she had ignored for weeks had finally taken control. The stress, the delay, the waiting. It had all pushed her body too far. Grayson stood just outside the emergency room. Medical staff worked. His heart pounded, but his voice stayed calm when the nurse asked for information. Her name is Marlowe Bennett, he said clearly. She needs that surgery approved. It's urgent. Her condition has progressed faster than expected. We cannot delay much longer. The words landed heavy, but the insurance decision is still pending, Grayson replied. We are pushing for immediate authorization, the doctor said. We've marked it as medically urgent again. The hospital administration is contacting the insurer directly. The triplets stood beside him, holding onto his hands. Elodie squeezed tighter than usual. Brooks looked toward the doors as if watching for signs. Tatum whispered softly, she's not alone. Now he was standing in the middle of something life-changing. He remembered the day Lila's surgery had been delayed over pay. He remembered promising himself that if he ever saw someone else facing the same fight, he would not step back. I'm not leaving, he told the nurse quietly. He meant it. Hours passed in the waiting area. The hospital board had been notified. Daniel Calder arrived personally, his expression serious but compassionate. I have spoken to the insurance liaison. They understand the urgency, but understanding and approval. Meanwhile, the small online art page created by the triplets, teachers shared updates. Parents commented with encouragement. Someone from the local community group tagged the hospital's public outreach. The message was never angry. It was clear and hopeful. Stand beside those fighting for care. Pressure builds differently when kindness spreads in steam. Inside a corporate office miles away, the insurance board reviewed Marlowe's case again. The classification error was obvious now, but approving it would mean reversing a formal denial under public attention. Someone high in management hesitated, worried about precedent. Yet community awareness made delay riskier than... Back in the hospital waiting room, Grayson opened his banking app quietly. He looked at his savings. The money he had slowly built over years of long shifts and careful budgeting for. It was not enough to cover the entire surgery, but it could start something. He walked to the admissions desk. If the authorization doesn't come through in time, he said steadily, start the procedure. I'll sign the financial responsibility. Sir, this could cost more than you expect. I know, he answered calmly. Elodie overheard and looked up at him. Dad, he knelt beside his children. Sometimes Ying costs something, he said softly, but leaving costs more. They nodded. They understood. When Marlowe regained brief consciousness, she saw Grayson sitting beside her bed. The triplets were curled up in chairs nearby, refusing to go home. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak. You stayed. Grayson gave a small smile. You shouldn't have to fight this alone. Tears filled her eyes, not from fear this time, but from something warmer. For months, she had prepared herself to handle everything by now. Someone was choosing to remain. The emotional shift was quiet, but powerful. She was no longer just a patient she was part of something. Outside the operating room, tension built as minutes passed. Doctors prepared equipment, ready to begin if approval arrived or not. Daniel Calder checked his phone repeatedly. The hospital administrator stood nearby, waiting for confirmation from the insurance board. Grayson stood tall, steady hands resting on his children's shoulders. He did not show panic. He showed presence. Suddenly, the administrator's phone buzzed. Everyone froze. He looked down at the screen, reading carefully. His expression changed, but no one could yet read whether it was relief or concern. Grayson's heart pounded louder than the machine's. The administrator looked up slowly. Just seconds before the surgery was set to begin, the final authorization update appeared, and everything depended on what it said. The call that once sounded like the end of hope became the beginning of something none of them expected. The hospital administrator looked up from his phone, his serious expression finally softening. The insurance board has issued an emergency override, he announced. The surgery is authorized in full. For a second, no one moved. Then Grayson let out a breath he did not realize he... Nan holding. Elodie covered her mouth. Brooks closed his eyes in quiet relief. Tatum whispered, "She's going to be okay." The reversal had come under pressure. Medical urgency, board review, and growing community awareness had put him to correct its mistake. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Marlo would receive the care she needed. The surgery proceeded that afternoon. Grayson stayed in the waiting room the entire time, refusing offers to go home and rest. The triplets sat beside him like quiet guardians, drawing small pictures on hospital notepads. Elodie sketched a tree again, this time with deeper roots. Brooks wrote the word "stay" in bold letters across the top of his page. Tatum colored a bright sunrise behind a hospital building. Hours later, the surgeon stepped out with steady reassurance. The procedure. She will need time to recover. But it went well. Relief moved through Grayson's chest like warmth after a long winter. He thanked the doctor quietly, not with dramatic words, but with deep gratitude. Recovery was not instant. The days that followed were slow and fragile. Marlo woke up groggy, vulnerable, unsure of what the next months would hold. But every time she opened her eyes, someone was there. Sometimes. Often it was Grayson sitting in the corner with a book, or the triplets perched carefully near her bed, speaking softly about school or art project. She was not used to that kind of presence. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered one evening when Grayson helped adjust. "You don't have to," he replied simply. "We just stayed." After she was discharged, her apartment felt too quiet to return to alone. The hospital social worker suggested temporary in-home care, but before Marlo could even respond, Elodie spoke gently. "You could stay with us for a little while." Grayson looked at his children, then at Marlo. The offer was not impulsive, it was natural. "If you're comfortable with that," he said carefully, "just until you're stronger." For the first time in years, Marlo allowed herself to accept help without feeling ashamed. She moved into their small house with a single overnight bag. The days that followed were filled with quiet healing. Marlo helped the triplets with their art homework. She taught Brooks how to mix colors properly. She showed Tatum how to sketch shadows. Elodie and she spent long afternoons painting together, laughter slowly replacing hospital silence. The community continued to rally. Meals appeared at the door. The stand beside art page grew into a local movement about kindness and difficult. Parents shared stories. Teachers reached out. What started as 3 children refusing to ignore pain had grown into something larger than anyone expected. Grayson noticed something inside himself shifting too. For years, he had carried everything alone. Bills, bedtime routine, emotional weight. Now, when he came home from work, someone else asked how his day had been. Someone else reminded him to sit down and rest. The house felt fuller, not louder, but steadier. He was no longer the only adult holding the line. One evening, as the sun dipped behind their backyard fence, the 5 of them sat together on the porch. The triplets leaned against Marlo, as if it had always been that. She smiled softly, stronger now, color returning to her face. "You know," she said quietly, "I thought that voicemail was the worst moment of my life. Sometimes the worst moments open doors we never planned to walk through. But we did." Tatum interrupted gently. Brooks added, "And we stayed." Elodie smiled. "That's what families do." Marlo's eyes filled not with fear this time, but with belonging. She had walked into a hospital alone. She walked out into something she had never known she needed. There was no dramatic promise about, no grand declarations, just shared dinners, shared responsibility, shared presence, the kind of bond built not by blood, but by choice. Grayson realized something as he watched the children laugh beside her. His loneliness had not disappeared overnight. It had softened. It had been divided among shoulders willing to carry it with. The voicemail that once felt like a sentence had become a starting point. Sometimes, the news that sounds like the end is actually the beginning of connection. Sometimes the people who overhear your worst moment become the reason you survive it. Grayson looked at Marlo, then at his children, feeling warmth settle deep inside his chest. He understood then that the voicemail meant to end hope had built a family none of them were. And sometimes the people who hear your darkest message. If this story moved you, don't just let it end here. Stay with stories that remind us that kindness still, that systems can be challenged, and that family is sometimes chosen in the hardest moments. Share this with someone who believes in standing beside others, and subscribe if you want more stories where quiet strength changes. And now I want to ask you something honestly. If you overheard someone's worst moment like they did, would you walk past it, or would you choose to stay? Tell me in the comments.